Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us this week. We're on Facebook doing this live, and we've been in past weeks on Instagram talking with some other people about the faith lives of young people in various contexts, different religious traditions and expressions, how it intersects with identities like race and sexuality. We've got here today with two people working on college campuses. Harrison Blum is the Director of Religious and Spiritual Life at Amherst. And Reverend Sumi Kim is the coordinator of Buddhist life at Yale. And so we're going to be talking all about young people and Buddhism, which is a sort of fascinating intersection that we don't get to hear enough about, especially when especially considering that there's so much alignment between what we see in the research and surveys about what young people express in terms of the values that they want to uphold and live out in their faith and spiritual lives, and the values often expressed through Buddhism. And so we're going to talk about where those intersections are. Before we get started, I'll just make one quick plug. We've got a fellowship opportunity coming up. It's a funded fellowship aimed at BIPOC graduate students in the social sciences. We get to use our data set. We'll support your own research. You can find more about that on our website. It starts this summer and will carry you through this summer and next academic year. So it's a 12-month-long fellowship. Happy to answer questions about it. If you want to find me, I'm at josh@springtideresearch.org for my email. But let's get into this. So Harrison, Sumi, maybe can you both just tell us a little bit about sort of what your actual day-to-day looks like? I know that they're direct, there's offices of spiritual life, obviously, and religious life at many universities. Although, Sumi, I can't imagine that there's a whole lot of coordinators of Buddhist life that exist across most college campuses. So that's maybe a little bit unique in terms of its specificity. But just help our audience understand maybe a little bit of what that day-to-day looks like, during COVID especially, but even what you're imagining the fall will look like.
I guess I'll go first since you mentioned my name first. My job is to serve as the Buddhist chaplain, and I serve several functions. One is to lead and teach meditation. That's the primary interest of many students, meditation from a Buddhist perspective, as well as to convey the core teachings of the Buddhist tradition in a way that is useful to the students' everyday lives. On top of that, I do quite a bit of pastoral counseling. So I meet with students one-on-one to talk about how spiritual perspective can support them in their journey. And then I do various administrative tasks. I also sit on panels and join interfaith discussion groups, visit classes as a representative of the Buddhist faith tradition, and so on. So those are the things that I undertake, and it hasn't changed that much with the pandemic, except that we go online and I do a lot of the pastoral counseling online, and that'll be changing in the autumn. And one reason it really hasn't changed very much is because Buddhism is primarily concerned with stress and suffering, as well as flourishing. And those concerns have endured and perhaps intensified with the pandemic. So in a way, the pandemic has been good for Buddhist business. I hesitate to say that, but that's the truth of it. I'll pass it over to Harrison.
I was just getting into listening to a Dharma talk mode, hearing you talk about alleviating suffering. I was like, yes, say more. I'll just listen for 30 minutes, but I will also speak, and I'm glad to be here. Thanks for hosting us, Josh, and for Springtide for the great work you do to help us understand Generation Z and younger people's experience. Something I sometimes say, and I somewhat believe, is that when I was a Buddhist advisor, like at Northeastern, or working as a chaplain on an adolescent psychiatric unit or medical units, that I was 70% offering pastoral care and 30% doing administrative work to wrap around that. Now, as the Director of Religious and Spiritual Life at Amherst College, maybe I do something like 70% administrative work, and if I'm fortunate, 30% pastoral care. And the pastoral care is really kind of the exciting, nurturing parts that might look like and has looked like Sumi referred to, meeting with students over Zoom, sometimes on campus, we're at distance with masks, usually outside, but meeting to talk about all sorts of things. So there are Buddhist interested students who ask about, perhaps it's a relationship challenge that gets them in the door. And then once we have some conversation, perhaps some resolution a bit around their heart and holding that, let's say, breakup or challenge, they then are curious, well, how can I hold my career goals or the difference between my and my family's values also with a bit of ease or openness or advocacy? And I'll just, I guess for now, I'll lastly say that I try to remind myself that it is true that even the administrative work can be life-giving. Like it might take some Google Docs and meetings and emails to then finally get at the interfaith retreat where a few dozen students are connecting and experiencing each other's spiritual practices. So those are some parts of what I do.
That's a good reminder for all of us, Harrison. Administrative work can be life-giving. That's important for, I think, a lot of people to remember. When we think about, you're starting to see the first cohorts of Gen Z move through higher ed. And as you experience them both on campus and in other places, what do you think it is about Buddhism that might attract Gen Z to the tradition or to the practices even? And do you see them engaging, in whole, or is it like they're taking little nibbles off and adopting certain practices, or, sort of dipping a toe into the water, so to speak?
Shall I go first?
Sure.
Well, yeah, this is a great question, and I thought about it over the last few days. So there's a professor at Yale who offers a course titled Buddhism and Atheism, and it was the most sought after course the last semester that it was offered, wildly popular. And since that professor was my husband, I was able to ask him.
I was just about to ask that.
I was able to ask him, why are the students so interested in this course? In order to get into the course, they had to write 300-word essays explaining their reasons for taking the course. And so I was privileged to kind of take a look at them. And what I saw is that the answers fell roughly into two categories. Some students were churched. They had been raised with a faith tradition in their childhood, whether, Islam, Hinduism, Christianity, and so on. But they were not finding that supportive or wholly satisfying for them as they entered into their independent adult years. But they still wanted some way of practicing religion or some spiritual path. And so they felt that Buddhism offered that as a possibility. The other category of responses were, and this is the part that surprised me, and it's somewhat new, I would say, and it's maybe more widespread with Gen Z than in previous generations, are students who said they were raised with nothing. They had had no faith tradition. In fact, religion was so not a part of the family's culture that they didn't even know the words agnostic or atheist. Like it wasn't in the picture at all. And what those students tended to say was something like, I feel like materialism or the standard conventional way of going through life, having a family, career, and all of that, I feel like all that's good, but somehow insufficient. And I feel like there has to be something more. I'm looking for meaning and purpose. And it seems like Buddhism might offer a framework for that. What both of those groups of students seem to have in common is that they would say, as your research bears out, that they're spiritual but not religious, SBNR, right? Mm-hmm. And that they have a conception that Buddhist philosophy in particular and meditation practice from the Buddhist tradition offers a way of doing spiritual but not religious. And then once they take those courses and, come to a group like the Buddhist student community and, talk with me, I think they come away with a slightly more complex picture that, Buddhism can behave like a religion. It has ways in which it's a religion. And it's also, particularly in its modern and somewhat westernized version, is offering a way of doing SBNR. So that's a short answer from my end, and I'd love to hear what your perspective is, Harrison.
Yeah,
I can really echo what you were sharing, Sumi, and for me, that was true. I grew up Jewish, had a bar mitzvah in the Reform tradition, was somewhat spiritually a free agent. I could kind of simplify my label as agnostic as well as Reform Jewish. And so for me, Buddhism was tremendously appealing in that a belief in God was not a gatekeeper to participation. And I think I see that as you do with students who, using the word or not, might identify as atheist or agnostic. And I hope not to project what was true for me onto these students too much, but I think that I see in them also what appealed to me, the curiosity about my heart and my mind, hopes and fears, the mind-body connection. I saw Buddhism as meeting that curiosity, giving tools to understand those items better. I'm kind of playing with a metaphor. I'm not a programmer, but open source technology, maybe there's a metaphor there, and not to downplay the importance of Buddhist teachers, but I find, I think other younger people find, an invitation in Buddhist practice that their own experience is the spiritual laboratory, that we can all be users and experimenters in our spiritual paths, somewhat unmediated or not overly mediated, perhaps, by structures. I think I'll also say, and I may just switch rooms in a minute if my internet is cutting my sound out, but I'll give an attempt at saying that there can be this perceived result, like, oh, I like Buddhism because I like peace, or I want to go toward Buddhism because I want to relax. That's not ill-advised, but I think people pretty quickly find out, there may be some mistaken expectations if they think Buddhism is about turning away from suffering, or meditation is about always feeling good. I think those can be reasons people come and sometimes stay with Buddhist practice.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Harrison. Sumi.
Oh yeah, I want to just, be sure to address the second part of your question, Josh. And I'm sure Harrison's going to have thoughts on this as well. But what I heard in part of your question is, how are Gen Z, how are young adults adopting Buddhism, and in what way are they bringing that into their lives? And what I'm seeing is that they, especially through, I would say, the early 20s, mid 20s, remain, as Harrison say, a free agents. They're kind of cobbling together different things, particularly from the wellness side of the secular world, and then a little bit like with the spiritual, maybe a little bit from their past if they were churched, and they'll sort of, I think they'll sort of float on that, but very few actually become Buddhist or would say that they're Buddhist. And that's not really that generational. That actually comes a bit from the Buddhist tradition itself, which eschews such kind of strengthening of identities that can end up reifying the ego and self-centeredness. So there's that. And then Buddhism generally doesn't have a very strong conversion process. Like there's, since it's not a belief-based system, you don't go from one belief system into another belief system. And so there are very few markers for moving into a Buddhist modality. So more often people would say, well, I practice the Buddhist path, or I practice meditation and I study Buddhist philosophy. In the late 20s, and particularly once young adults get into family life, then the deliberateness and the intentionality of funneling one's attention and resources into Buddhist practice become a little bit stronger. And then when the children are along, that's another decision point about whether to really invest in Buddhism. But I know people in their 70s who've been practicing Buddhism for 40, 50 years, and they still won't say they're Buddhist. We tend to say I'm Buddhist when we're around other people who are using labels like I'm Catholic or I'm Episcopalian or something like that. So it's often an apologetic move on the part of Buddhists. And that's true even in Asia, among people who were raised Buddhist.
Oh, it's really interesting. I mean, you used words like cobbling together or phrases like cobbling together. And that's a lot of what we were seeing. I was reflecting on this year's survey findings. It's all 13 to 25-year-olds at Springtide, and we're trying to think about, how does this line up with the past, and is there anything new here? Is this an extension of other things? And I was immediately thought of Robert Bella's notion of Sheilaism from Habits of the Heart back 40 years ago. This notion that there was this person, Sheila, who was just sort of like a buffet picking things, to make her own religious system, so to speak, spirituality. But what struck me about Gen Z, what we kept seeing in the data, is that it wasn't so much that they were, if there were 15 individuals, you would have 15 different individual faith expressions. It's what we keep seeing is that wherever they're going and whatever they're adopting, they keep doing so with an eye towards community. Where can I do this with other people? Where can I be my full self? Where can I ask the kinds of questions and get, responses from other people who've been through the same thing? And so, as opposed to, which I think for a lot of adults, parents, religious leaders out there who are trying to work with young people, I think it can look on the surface very potentially like that kind of narcissism that you might have found in what Bella was describing 40 years ago. But if you just scratch the surface a little bit deeper, I think we get to the stuff that you both are talking about here, which is like, oh, that doesn't actually seem to be what's going on. I mean, they're not necessarily going to take the institutional system that they're, I wouldn't even say parents at this point, maybe it's grandparents would be handing down to them. But that doesn't mean that they're just sort of making their own individual plate from the buffet either. And so we're in this really interesting time, and I'm curious, Harrison, about about that second part of the question. I mean, have you seen, to what extent do you see people like it? Are you seeing students come through like, oh, this, with that misguided notion maybe that it's about peace and reducing stress only, and so they're like coming up through exams time and like, teach me how to meditate real quick so I can calm down, like, or are you seeing a more authentic engagement with really trying to understand the core tenets?
Good question, and it's going to leave me wondering. And some of my observations do include that, yeah, there is a deeper engagement happening, even if it begins with, I saw a Keanu Reeves movie and Buddhism looks cool. I think it pretty quickly goes deeper. And I maybe one of the most consistent practices I see is hard to see. It's rigorous introspection. It's kind of an active and cultivated and in community discussed curiosity about just what is this? What is my human experience, and how do I skillfully have a heart and a mind and relationships and obligations? And to your word, I think you used culture or community, Josh. That's what I saw in the Buddhist group at Northeastern when, certainly not mainly to my credit, but to the students' credit who showed up and really were their full selves with each other. That group grew from about 8 people a week to 25 and sometimes mid-30s each week, showing up and meditating together and getting in small groups and diving in to discuss Buddhist teachings. I don't know if I could say it because they really wanted to understand Buddhist teachings. I think it's because they really wanted to understand and have some ease with their human experience. And that is the Buddhist teaching. So I guess I will also say that that's all beautiful, and that makes me want to address an edge that I see as a pattern, which is people wanting to be mindful in the moment, have some good conversations, maybe read a few books, but not necessarily invest in a formal seated meditation practice. So that is one of the reminders I kind of find myself offering, which is that it's great to be mindful in the moment, and that is really supported by a formal practice. So trying not to let the formal seated, quiet, maybe boring, maybe sleepy, maybe not on a phone practice be a part of people's engagement with Buddhism.
Maybe not on the phone.
I'm just going to amen what Harrison said. If I can, am I allowed to do that? So one thing, Josh, that, as you were wondering, where will Gen Z go? Yeah. With the way that this kind of bricolage, this casserole of practices and ideas. But so one thing that's become apparent to me as I've studied the boomers, Gen X, millennials, and now Gen Z, is to differentiate between generational values and trend lines, and developmental. Like what happens to the 18 to 24-year-old brain? Like what's going on in that period of their life? And so I'm hesitant to ascribe the bibimbap casserole spirituality, buffet spirituality that we see with Gen Z as necessarily being the long-term trajectory of that group, because when now being 10 years a chaplain and 25 years studying generational stuff, I do think that there's this initial shopping period, which given the context that we're in, where you do have everything available here in America, is appropriate. And then as the person gets into, their late 20s and again, family life and so on, there's a winnowing and a clarification. And often people will return back to their childhood roots, but they'll come into it with much greater appreciation. They might still incorporate meditation. They'll actually do meditation practice instead of just the moment-to-moment mindfulness that Harrison is mentioning. So I think that I want to discern between like what's characteristic of Gen Z and what's characteristic of being a young adult. And I don't think we know just yet where this is going, but I do think that you're picking up on this thread of community, the awareness of community as being the ground within which we root ourselves for serious spiritual development, belonging, safety, nervous system functionality and regulation and so on. I think that this newer generation is really in tune and really seeking that. Why exactly is an interesting question to explore, but I agree with what you're observing there.
Well, that's really heartening to hear. It's one thing to see it in the data. We wrote a whole book about it called Belonging, just because the epidemic of loneliness among young people is so counterintuitive to what we expect when we think of a young person as, like really on their phones, attached to friends and social networks at all times. But, from big health conglomerates like Cigna down to like, sort of specialized research institutes like us, like we see that trend all over the place. That Varun Soni at USC, is the Dean of Religious Life, wrote about this in an op-ed for the LA Times a while ago, talking about just the rampant loneliness and isolation that he saw among students at USC. And, so we see this all over the place, and the community. I think, that's sort of like all the roads then lead back to trying to solve that problem as much as possible. But as you point out, like how equipped developmentally is are any of us in our teenage years to really solve that? I think religious guides, spiritual mentors, adults who are trusted, like they have really critical roles to play in this time where maybe the traditional, or sort of, I use traditional loosely here, going back all of maybe 70 years or something, those ties are not as strong as maybe they once were. And so there can be, I think, a real sort of like, well, where do I start? And I think, in our data, we see, I think, a good example of that, which is a relatively big gulf between many of the things that would be associated with Buddhism, like meditation. So, when we look at the rates of people who meditate sometimes, we see a much higher percentage than, of course, the young people who would identify as Buddhist, which tracks right along with the national average around 1 or 2%. Right. And so in part, it's like, okay, we need to do a better job of like, I just imagine all these, and we hear this in the interviews, this is actually what's happening, is all these young people who are sort of like, they maybe pick up one book, or as Harrison mentioned, they see it in a movie, so they're going to try to meditate with like virtually no guidance on how to do it. Maybe they'll Google something, or see somebody on Instagram, more likely. But there are people like you out there, right, that can actually like, really embed you in a system to make this more meaningful, and probably, help you to get off your phone while you're doing that kind of work. For those, what kind of, if you were talking directly to young people, I'm not in a sales pitchy way, but what do you think that young people don't understand about Buddhism that would be most helpful to them if they're, watching this, or if somebody stumbles across? What would you say to a young person about Buddhism, especially, we're coming out, we're hopefully coming out of this pandemic, but it's been a relatively chaotic 18 months here.
This might not be the first thing I say, but it does make me think of how I will say to people who say to me, well, Buddhism is not really a religion. I try to do a little respect and educational piece there with, by saying like, it might not be to you, but it is to thousands and thousands of people over thousands of years. So just to contextualize that there are many Buddhisms, and to try to empower them, should it be an appropriate part of that conversation, that, as I believe, we are a part of making Western Buddhism, and that's tricky. We should be talking about lineage and empowerment and cultural appropriation and adaptation, and indeed Buddhism, as we see with other religions, does adapt and grow and change over century and continent and culture. So kind of both reminding them that the Buddhism they are interested in is not the only one, and the one that they are interested in, they're actually helping to form, because generations from now, what we do with Buddhism today will impact what it means to be Buddhist in the United States in the future, I believe.
I'm having a hard time thinking of an answer to your question, because Buddhism generally has a pretty favorable status.
Yeah.
Most people have a positive image. The old idea that Buddhism is nihilistic because it says life is suffering, thankfully has more or less been corrected. And, people are much more under the impression that Buddhism is about happiness, thanks to the Dalai Lama's efforts, among others. But actually, I'll answer the question slightly in reverse, which is, what misconceptions might adults have about young people who are coming into Buddhist spaces? Because that's something I've had to pay attention to from my seat. And what I quickly learned with Gen Z, and maybe working both at Duke and at Yale, because they have a high international population as well as a very diverse population, is to make no assumptions about who's walking in the door. And that an Asian American or a Asian international person can just as much be Catholic or Protestant, Episcopalian, et cetera, as a white person or Black person coming in with retreat experience and actually calling themselves Buddhist. And might even speak fluent Tibetan. I actually know some people like that. And so I have found that identities have become much more complex with the younger generation. And so I always need to be on my toes about who's coming in. That being said, I find that there are basically 4 reasons that young people come to Buddhism. One is looking at, how can I work with my stress? Another is, what is this suffering that's happening, as Harrison said, a breakup, or, struggle with parents, or sometimes the loss of a friend from high school and so on. So suffering, stress, suffering. Questions of salvation, what does it mean to be liberated, to be awake, to be free? And then questions of existential questions. What's my identity? Who am I? And so sometimes to remember those 4, I have to remember the acronym S, suffering, S, stress, S, salvation, EX, existential questions. And I think there's an acronym there that will help me remember it, but I'm not sure. But anyway, those 4 are perennial. And so whatever way that I have to kind of take Buddhism and meditation practice and then just slightly shift it to meet those 4 concerns, whatever is coming in the door there. And then that's just a starting point. And then over time, try to unfold and complexify the Buddhist tradition and, how it might be supportive, and, expand the factors so that it's not just about their personal concern, but also includes questions around environmental action and social justice, racial justice, relationships, the ability to have empathy, development of compassion, and to expand their circle of concern outwards until it's, as comprehensive as possible.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, the diversity that you speak of is one of these hallmarks of Gen Z. And one of the things we keep trying to get across to religious leaders is that, you know, in order to understand Gen Z, you really have to understand the diversity of how they're walking through the door. And that means not just that they want to see their own diverse identities represented and welcomed, but that they care about diversity as an abstract value. That they, you know, it isn't this sort of maybe self-centered or narrow-driven approach to diversity, but that there's a sort of a universal good and value to diversity, period. And you know, recognizing, just sort of taking that posture, I think that's something we can all learn from there, because I think it would serve a lot of people well. Well, I know we're right up at the top at the 30-minute mark, but maybe I could get you out of here each with this question, which is, you know, we're going to be, you both work on campuses. We're going to be coming into an academic year in the fall that's hopefully going to look very much different than the last one. I don't think anybody's been particularly loving this past academic year. How are you thinking about this in terms of the work that you do with young people as they return to campuses and what you're doing over the summer? I mean, what kinds of things will you be focusing on to help them sort of make sense out of what just happened to them?
Great question. This will be partly an answer, but I think that this is not a new realization, but I think the past year highlighted for me and colleagues the importance of being together and not just programming together with not all students on campus, with even less staff on campus in terms of hours and what we used to see. There was, you know, for good reason, there were less in-person gatherings on campus. And so when we did see each other outside under a tent or handing out macaroni and cheese at night last fall on election night, just as a kind of self-care, here's something tasty to eat. I hope you're not as much of a nervous wreck as you might be as we await the election results. Just kind of like food, sustenance, space, and presence. We know these are important, and I think it's highlighted just how important they are. So one of my emerging goals is to create perhaps a more regular time, maybe without as much of an agenda or a program, or maybe even a title. Can we just be together more and more often?
Yeah, I love that idea.
I must say, I'm not quite sure, because we'll have this summer, and so I'm not sure, you know, as students get vaccinated and enter it back into normalcy, where we'll quite be in August. They may have gotten back into a normal pace of things, you know, social skills come back online and, you know, all that kind of stuff. So we'll have to do a temperature check as we get closer to August. But I do think that a lot of people discovered that there is something valuable about sitting quietly with oneself. And I think some people are going to miss that as they move into more social modalities, which is going to be very joyful for all of us. But they might miss, you know, the moments of quiet, and especially what a Buddhist space offers, this unique combination of being quiet and within oneself with other people. And so that's a very beautiful way to be both social and also introverted. And so I think I'll be creating time and space as a refuge from the kind of hyperactivity that can happen when we come back on campus and, you know, oh, so great to see you. And, you know, we kind of get this huge wave of energy, and it can knock us off balance a little bit. And then, hey, you know, come over to the meditation space and let's sit quietly and breathe together and reconnect. The other thing that I noticed is that people are really enjoying or noticing anyway that people have allowed themselves to be more vulnerable and more revealing than they have in the past. I don't know if it's a function of Zoom. We'll have to find out. But I think many people want to keep moving forward with allowing the revelation of one's complexities and true self to be present in person. And so I'm going to try to think about how do we set programming up that helps people to continue with that.
It's such a lovely sentiment. I mean, you both hit on the same notion in a roundabout way, but that we learned real things about ourselves. Like, we adopted new practices that, you know, over the last year that functionally, pragmatically, probably are not going away. Like, you know, once you know something deeply about yourself, it's hard to unknow that thing. But also things that shouldn't go away, that, you know, sitting quiet, learning how to, you know, a lot of people figure out how to be alone, not by their own choice, but it was just a thing that was forced and thrust upon them. But then once you sort of figure that out, I think, you know, not for everyone, certainly, but for a lot of people, that's something that they will not want to let go of. But as you mentioned, Sumi, it will be so easy because they're, you know, all of our sort of institutional structures are basically still intact. I mean, classrooms are going to look more or less the same at some point. Workplaces are going to look, and, you know, so it's going to be this sort of, it'll be hard to hold on to those things without, as you both mentioned, some explicit guidance and space, both metaphorical and literal for those things. I think those are really good reminders for everyone to think about. And one of the things that we just published a new normal, which is has these 8 exercises in empathy to sort of help adults understand where young people are coming from based on the data that we were collecting with them about coming out of the pandemic. And one of the things that became clear there was that this reemergence, it has the potential to be as disruptive as going in. It will not be as abrupt. It will not be as unexpected, certainly, but psychologically, you know, spiritually, socially, it has the potential to be as disruptive as going into the lockdowns. And so wanting to really encourage religious leaders to do what you all were just talking about, which is to navigate those spaces with some real care and intention, and to understand that, like, it's not just going to be a party come, you know, when we get back to work or back to campuses or whatever it is. It's going to be, it needs to be this really intentional, gradual emergence back into those spaces with things thoughtfully held, not just, you know, honoring the losses that occurred over the last year, but also celebrating the real gains and accomplishments that were made for a lot of people that often just went unrecognized because there was a gathering of people to, you know, have them with. I mean, people still had babies, people still, you know, had, like, got new jobs and graduated and all these things that we just didn't get the normal markers for. So I think those practices will come in really handy. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for being here. If people want to get in touch with you or see more about the work you're doing, what's a good place, a website or a social media handle that they can reach out to you?
They can go to buddhistlife.yale.edu for more information or to contact me.
Wonderful.
And similar at Amherst College, if you just search Amherst College Religious or Spiritual Life, you'll find me, or just search my name, Harrison Blum. I have a separate website, but there's lots of ways to find my email. I'm happy to be in touch with people.
Wonderful. Well, again, thank you so much. I'll put one more plug in for the BIPOC Research Fellowship over at Springtide. You can find information there at springtideresearch.org, or you can just contact me directly. I'll be happy to send you the posting, josh@springtideresearch.org. Again, thanks so much for taking time out of your Wednesday. We'll be posting this so people can still interact with it. I hope you all have a wonderful week. Bye, folks.